Thanks, Ciancorla. I think in some ways it really is a sort of an indictment of the situation. This is the first time we're actually discussing regulations at all in relation to the area of vehicle clamping, because what we've had on the ground now in many areas really is some companies operating in essence like extortion rackets, that you've clamping firms literally patrolling the streets, almost trying to ensnare and entrap unsuspecting motorists, and that is certainly an area which absolutely needs to be regulated and controlled. And while I welcome the bill as a move in that direction, I'm not sure that it does it entirely, but I do welcome the fact that we are at last discussing the area of regulation. But in discussing regulation, we can't do that in a vacuum. We have to very much do it in the context of the companies which are providing that service. And myself and Deputy Wallace on a number of occasions have met with the clampers who carry out the work for Dublin City Council, for example, who as a result of, I suppose, the financial pressures and the huge amount of money that can be made from this activity, that these workers were being put under unbearable pressure in order to achieve targets and numbers of fines and clamps on people, which completely stood on its head any idea of what vehicle clamping should have been there for in the first place. So how do we, if that's something and a body of work that's done for a local authority, how much worse is it out there in the private sector, as it were, and how are these regulations actually going to be enforced? I mean, we talk in the Act about the NTA being given the power to oversee and enforce this legislation. Well, how much extra resources are they being given for this? How much extra finances for it? And I mean, to be honest with you, I would think that the NTA would be far better off spending their time on dealing with getting people out of cars and into public transport by developing a comprehensive public transport system in the cities around Ireland that would take the pressure off the parking situation and remove some of the pressures in that regard, while also, of course, contributing to reducing our carbon emissions and so on, rather than spending their time as being adjudicators in a bit of a money-making racket, which in some ways the whole area of clamping is. So while I welcome some regulation, to be honest, I prefer to see a situation where we're either massively restricting the ability of clampers to engage in their activity, or in some ways even banning it outright. Now, because I think we have to step back and look at why we're clamping and parking regulations or charges introduced in the first place. And the thinking behind it was very much the need to moderate driver behaviour. That's what it was supposed to be about, to ensure free flow, to stop the fellow who was so brazen that he blocked the yellow box, or he parked on the double yellow line where Garda resources weren't there to enforce it, caused an obstruction. Clamping gave a power to remove that obstruction and allow free flow. And I don't think any right-minded person would disagree with that. It was a valuable contribution, if you like, in the public interest, very important in terms of health and safety and so on. But that actual ethos, if you like, or excuse that was given to introduce clamping has absolutely been stood on its head. And parking fines and clamping are now a lucrative commodity. It's essentially what they are. In essence, what we're having in part is part of a process of the privatisation of public space. And it is a lucrative money spinner for the local authorities against the backdrop of massive cutbacks in their budgets, or for other more unscrupulous individuals as a fundraising mechanism for themselves. And I think that's a scenario that isn't just confined to Ireland. I mean, in Britain last year, the House of Commons Transport Committee had to examine the whole area, and they found in their studies that councils were exploiting parking fines in order to raise revenue illegally. That was the findings of the MPs there. The RAC found that the surplus from these activities, on and off street parking under public control, that they were raising almost 600 million annually from this revenue, and it became a source of funding which they relied on for their other activities. And it has become, as Deputy Ellis alluded to, a multi-million industry for Ireland. I mean, the figures were highlighted earlier this month. The 5 main city councils in Ireland collecting almost 50 million in parking payments, including clamping, since in 2013, and nationally the figure being 115 million annually being taken in by the local authorities, not to mind the private operators. And it is the case that you're having tens on thousands of vehicles being clamped in this city, for example, every year. And, you know, retailers and some of the businesses around the cities have made the point that there is an indication of overzealous driving or parking clamping regimes contributing to driving people away from the city centres and making it a deterrent to important economic activity there. I think the hard-pressed motorists have found something similar as well. And, you know, all this, let's be clear about it, is a consequence of a society which has not adequately invested in public transport. That's where the pressure is coming on. And parking and clamping have become another vehicle, really, for a type of stealth payment that people have to pay in some areas outside their own dwelling where they live. If they could be in an area regulated by a management company, where the management company is failing to provide a decent service, maybe it's in dispute with some of the residents in that company, and as a punitive measure they decide to bring in clamping, deny people the right to park outside their home unless they pay disputed payments in other areas. It's actually extortion, and meaning that people can't live comfortably in their own home, I think is absolutely disgraceful, and it certainly should be regulated far more even than we're providing for in this bill. I mean, the experience of public transport or of public clamping in the city has been one of being too successful. Because what you found was, in the early years when the clampers were introduced in Dublin, they actually did succeed in moderating driver behaviour, and you won't see any of some of the ridiculous carry-on that used to happen years ago. But because of that then, because the private company that activity was outsourced to was building in that it had to make a profit, part of the contract was built in was targets. And that's reprehensible, because if the targets are going up, it means that this is a revenue-generating exercise. In essence, it's another stealth charge on hard-pressed motorists who are already being